Standing beneath the central grinding stone of a decaying grist mill, Harrison used an angle grinder to cut open an iron hatch buried beneath the floorboards, revealing a secret subterranean vault housing a multi-million-dollar stash of pre-prohibition bourbon and original 1928 patents. Upstairs, his arrogant brother Radley celebrated ousting Harrison from their family's logistics empire, convinced he had humiliated him by tossing him a deed to a worthless, condemned property. Radley was completely oblivious that Harrison was currently standing on the very stolen legal foundation that would allow him to destroy Radley's career and reclaim his family's true legacy. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 60-story Hamilton Enterprises building in downtown Chicago, blurring the city skyline into a jagged smear of gray. Inside the mahogany-paneled boardroom, the atmosphere was even colder than the autumn storm brewing outside. Harrison Hamilton stood at the end of the long conference table, his hands gripping the leather back of his chair so tightly his knuckles had turned completely white. Across from him sat his older brother, Radley Hamilton. Radley was impeccably dressed in a bespoke Italian suit, lounging back with an air of practiced indifference. Beside Radley sat a row of corporate lawyers, their faces entirely devoid of emotion. "You can't do this, Radley." Harrison's voice was dangerously low, trembling with a mixture of suppressed rage and profound disbelief. "Dad built this logistics network from the ground up, and I spent the last 10 years expanding our routes across the eastern seaboard. You spent that time at country clubs and yacht parties. You can't just cut me out." Radley sighed, a sound of exaggerated exhaustion, and picked up a Mont Blanc pen, twirling it between his manicured fingers. "Harrison, please, let's not make this overly dramatic. It's bad for your blood pressure. The board has voted. The restructuring is complete, and frankly, your vision for the company is obsolete. I own 60% of the voting shares now. It's entirely legal, and more importantly, it is entirely final." "You manipulated the board," Harrison shot back, leaning forward. "You fed them inflated projections and buried the debt from your shell companies." When Dad's will was read, Radley interrupted sharply, his mask of indifference slipping to reveal a sharp, predatory sneer. He left the controlling interest to the son who actually understands modern capital, not the one who still wants to shake hands with truck drivers. "Security is waiting outside, Harrison. Your severance package is in the envelope on the table. Take it, and don't ever step foot in this building again." Harrison looked at the thick manila envelope resting on the polished wood. He opened it, expecting buyout documents or a check that would at least honor his decade of sweat equity. Instead, he found a single weathered document folded over a token check for $10,000. He unfolded the heavy yellowed parchment. It was a property deed. "The Oak Haven Mill?" Harrison asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Dad bought it in the 1980s for a tax write-off," Bradley said, checking his Rolex. "It's a dilapidated 19th-century grist mill in upstate New York, Oigo County to be exact. Structurally condemned. The county has been threatening to tear it down for a decade. Consider it a parting gift. You always liked getting your hands dirty. Now get out." 30 minutes later, Harrison stood on the wet pavement of Wacker Drive, clutching a cardboard box containing a framed photo of his late father, a few personal files, and the deed to a ruined mill. He had $32 in his checking account, having poured every cent of his personal savings into a recent Hamilton logistics expansion project, a project Radley now owned entirely. He was 34 years old, completely broke and homeless, as his corporate apartment lease was tied to his employment. With no other options, Harrison packed his modest Honda Accord, left the Chicago skyline in his rearview mirror, and drove east. The journey to Otsego County took 14 hours. The landscape shifted from towering skyscrapers to flat Midwestern highways, and finally to the dense, rolling, pine-covered hills of upstate New York. The GPS eventually lost signal, leaving Harrison to navigate by a crumbling county map he picked up at a gas station. He turned down a heavily rutted dirt road that hadn't seen fresh gravel in at least 40 years. The Honda's suspension groaned in protest as he navigated deep, muddy potholes. The dense canopy of ancient oak and hemlock trees blocked out the afternoon sun, casting the road into premature twilight. Finally, the road ended in a wind-overgrown clearing beside a rushing river. There, looming out of the mist like a forgotten ghost, was Oak Haven Mill. Harrison stepped out of the car, his boots sinking into damp earth. The sight was profoundly disheartening. The mill was a massive 3-story structure built of fieldstone and thick timber, but time and neglect had ravaged it. The roof sagged heavily in the middle, missing hundreds of cedar shingles. The massive wooden water heater on the side of the building was choked with thick, thorny vines, its wooden paddles splintered and rotting. Windows were either boarded up or shattered, staring out at the river like hollow eyes. He approached the heavy oak front door, which was secured by a rusted chain. Reaching into the bed of his car, Harrison grabbed a heavy tire iron and struck the padlock. With a metallic crunch, the rusted mechanism gave way. He pulled the chain loose and pushed the door open. The interior smelled of damp earth, mildew, and decades of stagnant air. Shafts of pale light pierced through the broken roof, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cold air. The main floor was a cavernous space, dominated by a massive cracked stone grinding wheel in the center. Rotted grain sacks, rusted iron gears, and collapsed wooden beams littered the floor. Harrison walked to the center of the room, looking at the sheer scale of the devastation. Any sane person would have turned around, driven into town, and sold the land to the nearest developer for whatever meager sum they could get. But as Harrison stared at the massive central timber pillar, running his hand over the deep, hand-honeyed axe marks in the wood, a strange sense of defiance washed over him. Bradley wanted him to break. Bradley wanted him to sell this place for pennies and fade into obscurity. A defeated man. "Not today," Harrison whispered to the empty room. "I'm going to rebuild this." That night, Harrison slept in his car, wrapped in a thin sleeping bag, listening to the roar of the adjacent river and the creaking of the old mill's timbers. The next morning, he drove into the nearby town of Red Creek, a sleepy, economically depressed village consisting of a hardware store, a diner, and a small community bank. He walked into the local branch of First Heritage Bank and asked for the manager, a woman in her late 50s, with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back into a practical bun, introduced herself as Beaksley Ramirez. "I need a construction loan," Harrison said, presenting the deed to Oak Haven Mill. Bexley looked at the deed, then looked at Harrison, her expression a mix of pity and amusement. "Mr. Hamilton, you're not from around here. Oak Haven Mill has been sitting empty since the 1920s. It's an environmental hazard. The foundation is likely compromised by the river, and the roof is a stiff breeze away from caving in entirely. "I can't approve a loan on a condemned property. I'm doing the labor myself," Harrison insisted. "I just need enough for materials. $10,000. I have it in a cashier's check from a severance payout, but I need a matching line of credit to get the roof stabilized before winter." Beaksley sighed, tapping her pen against the desk. She saw the desperation, but also the fierce, unyielding determination in Harrison's eyes. It was a look she rarely saw in the defeated town of Red Creek. "I can't give you a traditional loan," Bexley said finally, "but the town has a historical preservation grant program. It's rarely used, but it offers $15,000 for the stabilization of heritage sites. If you can prove the mill is structurally sound on the foundation level, I can push the paperwork through, but you'll need a local inspector to sign off." She handed him a business card. "Call Arthur Pendleton. He's the grumpiest structural engineer in the state, but he knows 19th century masonry better than anyone." Harrison thanked her, feeling a tiny spark of hope. The battle for the mill had just begun. The first 3 weeks at Oak Haven Mill were a masterclass in brutal, back-breaking agony. Harrison's hands, once accustomed to tapping on ergonomic keyboards in climate-controlled offices, were now perpetually covered in thick, bloody blisters and deep splinters. He woke at dawn every day, subsisting on cheap instant coffee and canned beans, and worked until the sun dipped below the treine, leaving him in pitch darkness. His first priority was clearing the debris. He hauled hundreds of pounds of rotted timber, shattered slate, and rusted machinery out of the main floor, creating massive burn piles in the clearing. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, but it was also therapeutic. Every swing of the sledgehammer, every heavy beam he dragged across the floor, was a blow against Radley. Arthur Pendleton arrived on a rainy Tuesday. He was a barrel-chested man in his 60s, with a thick white beard and a permanent scowl. Arthur walked around the exterior of the mill, stabbing at the mortar with a heavy steel screwdriver. He spent 2 hours in the muddy riverbank, inspecting the stone arches that supported the massive water he. When he finally stepped back inside, Harrison braced himself for the worst. "Well?" Harrison asked, wiping sweat and soot from his forehead. Arthur grunted, wiping his boots on a piece of scrap wood. The builders in 1870 knew what they were doing. They used hydraulic cement and local granite for the foundation. Despite 100 years of water battering it, the sheer weight of the masonry has kept it locked in place. It's settled, but it's not failing. Harrison let out a breath. He didn't know he was holding. "Don't celebrate yet, kid," Arthur warned, pointing up at the sagging roof. "Your truss system is compromised. The central load-bearing beam is rotting from the top down. If we get a heavy snowfall this winter, that roof is coming down and it's taking the walls with it. You need temporary steel supports, and you need to sister those joists immediately." With Arthur's signature on the inspection report, Bexley Ramirez pushed the historical grant through. Harrison had $25,000 total to his name. It sounded like a lot, but in the world of heavy construction, it was barely a drop in the bucket. He hired Arthur on a consulting basis and rented heavy-duty, hydraulic jacks to lift the sagging roof. For the next month, the mill became a chaotic symphony of loud mechanical groans, the screech of power saws, and the heavy thuds of sledgehammers. Slowly, painstakingly, the mill began to straighten. The roof was stabilized, the gaping holes patched with heavy industrial tarps against the impending winter, and the main floor was finally cleared of the century of debris. But by mid-November, the mud was entirely gone. Harrison sat on an overturned bucket near the central grinding stone, staring at a ledger book that told a grim story. He had zeroed out the grant money. I had maxed out 2 high-interest credit cards just to buy insulation and drywall for a small habitable corner of the first floor. Winter was rapidly approaching. The temperature was dropping below freezing every night, and he had no central heating. He was out of money, out of credit, and almost out of time. Just one more push, Harrison muttered to himself, rubbing his freezing hands together. Just need to prep the main floor for the commercial inspector. If he could get a basic occupancy permit, Beeksley had promised she could secure a commercial loan, allowing him to turn the mill into a high-end rustic event venue or a micro-distillery, something that could generate revenue. But to pass inspection, he had to replace the deeply rotted oak floorboards immediately surrounding the massive 3-ton grinding stone in the center of the room. Harrison grabbed a heavy steel crowbar and a framing hammer and got to work. The oak boards here were black with age and slick with decades of spilled rancid grain oil. He drove the crowbar into the seam between 2 thick planks and leaned back with all his weight. With a deafening crack, the wood splintered and gave way. A cloud of black dust plumed into the air, making Harrison cough violently. He tossed the broken board aside and wedged the crowbar under the next one. He worked in a rhythm strike: wedge, pull, discard. After removing a 4x4 50 section of the flooring, his crowbar struck something that didn't sound like wood. It didn't sound like the dirt earth beneath the floor either. It was a sharp, resonating metallic clank. Harrison stopped, his brow furrowing. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from his tool belt and clicked it on, shining the beam into the dark recess between the floor joists. Beneath the dust, spider webs and rat droppings, the light reflected off cold, dark steel. Heart pounding, Harrison grabbed a push broom and swept the debris away, coughing as the ancient dust filled his lungs. What he uncovered made him freeze in absolute shock. Set deeply into the thick stone foundation beneath the wooden floor was a heavy iron hatch. It was roughly 3 feet square, forged from thick riveted iron plates reminiscent of a submarine door or a bank vault. The edges were sealed with lead, and in the center of the hatch was a massive rusted iron wheel. A heavy industrial-grade padlock, the kind used for train cars, secured the wheel to a steel loop anchored in the stone. "What the hell is this?" Harrison breathed. According to the county blueprints Arthur had pulled, Oak Haven Mill had no basement. The foundation was supposedly solid stone and earth built directly over the bedrock by the river to support the massive vibrations of the grinding wheel. Yet here, hidden directly beneath the heavy central machinery, where no casual inspector would ever look, was a secure bunker. Harrison's exhaustion vanished, replaced by an electric surge of adrenaline. He scrambled to his tool bench, grabbing a heavy-duty angle grinder and a fresh cutting wheel. He ran an extension cord across the floor, plugged in the grinder, and lowered himself back into the hole. He flipped the switch. The grinder screamed to life. Harrison pressed the spinning abrasive disc against the heavy steel padlock. Sparks erupted in a brilliant fountain, illuminating the dark, dusty corners of the mill. The metal was incredibly thick, hardened steel that fought back against the blade. 10 minutes passed. Harrison's arms ACHD, and his safety goggles were coated in metallic dust. He had to swap out the cutting wheel twice, but finally, with a sharp, high-pitched ping, the heavy lock snapped in two. Harrison tossed the scorching hot metal aside. He grabbed the heavy iron wheel in the center of the hatch. It was stiff, seized by decades of rust and disuse. He braced his boots against the floor joists, gripped the wheel with both hands, and pulled with every ounce of strength he possessed in his weary body. With a horrific grinding screech of metal on metal, the wheel turned 1 inch, then 2. Finally, it gave way, spinning freely. Harrison grabbed the heavy iron handle and pulled upward. The hatch was incredibly heavy, but it was counterweighted on thick iron hinges. As it opened, a blast of air hit Harrison's face. It wasn't the damp, mildewed smell of the mill above. It was dry, eerily dry, carrying a faint scent of old paper, leather, and oak. He aimed his flashlight down into the abyss. A narrow, steep staircase, carved directly into the bedrock, descended into darkness. Taking a deep breath, Harrison stepped onto the first stone stair and began his descent into the unknown. The staircase spiraled downward for about 20 feet, much deeper than the river's waterline. The air grew noticeably cooler, but remained surprisingly devoid of moisture. Harrison realized that the builders had intentionally coated the walls with a thick layer of pitch and hydraulic cement, creating an entirely waterproof subterranean envelope. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped onto a smooth, poured concrete floor. He swept his flashlight beam across the darkness. The space was roughly 20-30 feet, supported by thick steel I-beams that clearly hadn't been installed in the 1870s. The retrofit looked like it belonged in the late 1920s or early 1930s. Harrison fumbled along the wall and found an old, heavy ceramic switch. Out of pure instinct, he flipped it. To his absolute astonishment, a series of caged industrial incandescent bulbs flickered, buzzed violently, and then bathed the room in a warm amber glow. The room was hooked into a separate off-the-G grid electrical line, likely tied directly to a hidden generator attached to the water wheel outside. Harrison lowered his flashlight, his mouth falling open as he took in the contents of the hidden room. It wasn't empty. Far from. Lining the far wall were floor-to-ceiling iron racks, stacked deeply with heavily reinforced wooden crates. The crates were branded with faded black ink, displaying logos of distilleries that hadn't existed for nearly a century. On the side of one prominent crate, the words Old Fitzgerald, bottled in bond 1918, were clearly legible. Harrison walked slowly toward the racks, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew enough about the luxury logistics trade to recognize what he was looking at. This was pre-Prohibition bourbon and rye whiskey. Hundreds of bottles of it, untouched, kept in absolute darkness at a perfect stable temperature of 55 degrees for nearly 100 years. He carefully pried the lid off one of the crates. Inside, nestled in dry straw, were glass bottles sealed with thick wax. The amber liquid inside was perfectly clear, undisturbed by time. To a high-end collector or a specialized auction house, a single bottle of this pedigree could fetch tens of thousands of dollars. There were at least 50 crates in this room. He had just stumbled upon a multi-million-dollar liquid gold mine. The financial relief washed over him like a tidal wave. He was saved. The mill was saved. But as he moved further into the room, his eyes caught something else. something that would alter the course of his life far more profoundly than antique whiskey. In the center of the room sat a massive, ornate musler safe, the kind of heavy iron behemoth usually bolted to the floor of major bank branches in the early 20th century. Unlike the hatch above, this safe was already open. Its heavy door was cracked ajar just an inch. Harrison approached it cautiously. He pulled the heavy steel door wide open. Inside the safe were no gold bars or stacks of cash. Instead, there were 3 items: a beautiful velvet-lined mahogany box, a stack of heavily yellowed architectural blueprints, and a thick leather-bound ledger book secured with a brass clasp. Harrison carefully lifted the ledger. The leather was dry and cracked, dusting his hands with brown flakes. He unhooked the brass clasp and opened the book under the dim amber light. The handwriting inside was elegant, looping cursive written in black fountain pen ink. Harrison looked at the name inscribed on the inside cover. Property of Arthur Hamilton, 1928. Harrison gasped. Arthur Hamilton was his great-grandfather. The official family history, the one parroted in every Hamilton Logistics corporate brochure and proudly recited by Radley at investor meetings, was that Arthur Hamilton had built the company from scratch in Chicago in 1932 through sheer grit and a small loan from a local bank. Harrison turned the fragile pages. The ledger wasn't a diary. It was a meticulous, detailed accounting record. It tracked illegal shipments, bootlegging routes across the Canadian border, and massive cash transactions. Arthur Hamilton hadn't been a scrappy shipping pioneer. He had been one of the largest RUMR runners in the Northeast, using Oak Haven Mill as his central distribution hub and money laundering facility. But as Harrison read further into the final pages of the ledger, the narrative took a dark and shocking turn. There was a final entry, dated the 14th of October, 1931. The feds are closing in on the Syracuse route. Thomas has turned on me. Thomas was Arthur's younger brother, Harrison's great-uncle. Thomas plans to seize the eastern assets and sign the network over to the syndicates in Chicago. He thinks I am ignorant of his betrayal. I have liquidated the primary operational accounts. $2.5 million in bearer bonds, heavily diversified. I am sealing them here alongside the original patents for the refrigeration rail cars I designed. Thomas will take the company name to Chicago, but he will build his empire on a hollow shell. The true wealth stays in Oak Haven. Harrison felt the air leave his lungs. He stared at the words, reading them a second time, then a third. The history he knew was a lie. The Hamilton Logistics empire that Radley now aggressively controlled hadn't been founded by their shared direct ancestor. It had been stolen by Thomas Hamilton. But Thomas had only stolen the infrastructure. The actual capital, the foundational wealth of the Hamilton family, had been hidden away by Arthur right here under the floorboards of this rotting mill. Harrison quickly reached back into the Mosler safe and pulled out the mahogany box. His hands were shaking uncontrollably as he undid the small latch and flipped the lid open. Inside, wrapped in oiled silk, were thick, heavy stacks of paper. Harrison carefully peeled back the silk. They were United States Treasury bearer bonds, issued in 1928. Because they were bearer bonds, they belonged entirely to whoever held them in their physical possession. They didn't require a name or a registered account. And resting alongside them were the original authenticated patent documents for the refrigerated transport cars that had revolutionized the American logistics industry. The very patents Hamilton Logistics still aggressively licensed to competitors to this day. Harrison sat back on his heels, the cold concrete floor seeping through his jeans, completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he held in his hands. Radley hadn't just kicked him out of the company. Bradley had kicked him out of a company built on a stolen legacy. And in his sheer arrogant ignorance, Radley had handed Harrison the very deed to the property where the true legal foundation of the empire rested. By right of the bearer bonds, the original patents, and a legal paper trail untouched by 70 years of corporate law, Harrison didn't just have enough money to rebuild Oak Haven Mill. He had the financial and legal leverage to annihilate Radley, seize Hamilton Logistics, and reclaim everything that was stolen from his bloodline a century ago. Harrison looked up at the ceiling of the bunker, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his soot-stained face. "You told me to get my hands dirty, Radley," Harrison whispered into the silence of the vault. "You have no idea what I just dug up." Harrison did not sleep that night. He sat at his makeshift plywood workbench under the harsh glare of a battery-powered lantern, surrounded by a fortune that had slept in the dark for nearly a century. The musty scent of the 1931 ledger and the crisp oiled silk of the bearer bonds filled the freezing air of the mill. He had to be smart. If Bradley caught even a whisper of what had been discovered at Oak Haven, he would tie Harrison up in brutal estate litigation for decades, bleeding him dry with corporate lawyers before Harrison could ever cash a single bond. The next morning, Harrison drove his battered Honda into Red Creek, parking behind First Heritage Bank. He walked into Beasley Ramirez's office, closed the blinds, and locked the door behind him. Beasley looked up, startled. "Harrison, what on earth is going on? You look like you haven't slept in a week." Without a word, Harrison placed a single sealed bottle of Old Fitzgerald 1188 on her desk, followed by the mahogany box. He opened it, revealing the stack of United States Treasury bearer bonds. Beasley's eyes widened behind her reading glasses. She reached out with trembling fingers, hovering over the paper without touching it. Are these real? Harrison bearer bonds haven't been issued since the 1980s. The Treasury phased them out because they are entirely untraceable. Whoever holds the physical paper owns the asset." "They are real," Harrison said, his voice deadly calm. "There's $2.5 million worth of original face value here. With nearly a century of uncollected interest, I don't even know what they are worth today. And there are 50 crates of this bourbon in a waterproof bunker under the mill. I need to liquidate the whiskey immediately, and I need a secure, anonymous way to process these bonds. But most importantly, I need a shark." Bexley leaned back in her chair, absorbing the shock. The Sleepytown banker suddenly found herself thrust into a high-stakes financial thriller. A shark? A corporate litigator who specializes in intellectual property and hostile acquisitions, Harrison clarified, pulling the 1028 refrigeration patents from his jacket pocket. "Bradley thinks he owns Hamilton Logistics, but he's operating on infrastructure that belongs to these patents that legally I now hold." Bexley nodded slowly, a fierce smile breaking across her face. "My brother-in-law is a senior partner at a firm in Manhattan. They handle corporate warfare for Fortune 500 companies. Let me make a phone call." Within 48 hours, the machinery of Harrison's revenge quietly whirred to life. The Manhattan attorney, a ruthlessly efficient man named Gregory Gregory Pierce, flew up to Syracuse and drove to the mill. Pierce was astounded by the sheer volume of legal ammunition Harrison had unearthed. "It's a perfect storm," Pierce explained, sitting on a rusted grain barrel as he reviewed the ledger. Thomas Hamilton stole the company, but he never officially dissolved Arthur's original holding corporation because he couldn't find the paperwork. He just assumed the patents were lost and kept using them. Hamilton Logistics has been infringing on your rightful intellectual property for 90 years. The backed royalties alone would bankrupt the current company. "I don't just want to bankrupt them," Harrison said, his eyes hard. "I want Radley to feel exactly what I felt when he handed me that deed. I want to take it all." Over the next 6 months, Oak Haven Mill underwent a miraculous transformation, acting as a smoke OKC screen for Harrison's true maneuvers. Through Pierce's firm, a private broker arranged a discreet closed-door auction in London for the Prohibition-era whiskey. The final gavel brought in a staggering $8.22 million. Harrison used a fraction of that money to properly restore the mill. He brought Arthur Pendleton back as the general contractor. They replaced the rotting timbers with custom-milled oak, restored the massive water wheel to generate sustainable electricity, and installed radiant floor heating beneath polished stone. The mill became a breathtaking architectural masterpiece, blending rustic 19th-century industrial design with cutting-edge modern luxury. But the vast majority of the whiskey money, combined with the staggering payout from cashing the first batch of bearer bonds, was funneled into a newly formed anonymous holding company, Oak Haven Capital. While Radley was busy in Chicago, throwing lavish parties and leveraging Hamilton Logistics with massive high-interest loans to fund a reckless expansion into automated trucking, Oak Haven Capital quietly went to work. Through a web of proxy buyers, Harrison began buying up Hamilton Logistics debt. Every time Radley took out a loan, Harrison's holding company purchased the promissory note from the banks. Radley was utterly oblivious. He was too arrogant to look at the fine print, too obsessed with his own genius to realize that the net was closing around him. He thought he was outsmarting the market, but he was merely borrowing money from the brother he had discarded. By late spring, the trap was fully set. Harrison owned 65% of Hamilton Logistics' corporate debt, and Pierce had finalized the patent infringement lawsuit. It was time to go back to Chicago. The Chicago skyline looked entirely different to Harrison this time. He wasn't a desperate, broken man staring up at the glass towers. I was a predator circling his prey. He stepped out of a sleek black town car in front of the Hamilton Enterprises building, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that cost more than his entire first year's salary. Beside him walked Gregory Pierce, clutching a thick leather briefcase. They bypassed the security desk, using Harrison's old corporate knowledge to slip into the executive elevator. On the 60th floor, the annual shareholder meeting was in full swing. Bradley Hamilton stood at the head of the boardroom, projecting a massive, overly optimistic revenue chart onto the screen. He was mid-sentence, bragging about a new fleet acquisition, when the heavy oak doors swung open. The room fell dead silent. Radley paused, his laser pointer dropping to his side, his face contorted into a mask of ugly fury. "Harrison, what the hell are you doing here? Security was supposed to have your face on a watch list." "Good morning, Bradley," Harrison said smoothly, stepping into the room. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer gravity of his presence commanded the attention of every billionaire investor at the table. "I apologize for interrupting. I'm here to call in a few debts." "Get out before I have you arrested for trespassing," Bradley spat, reaching for the phone on the conference table. "I wouldn't do that, Radley," Gregory Pierce said, stepping forward and placing a stack of heavily bound legal documents onto the polished mahogany. "As of this morning, my client, Mr. Harrison Hamilton, acting as the sole proprietor of Oak Haven Capital, is the majority debt holder of Hamilton Enterprises. Technically, he owns the chair you're sitting on." A collective gasp rippled through the board members. Bradley froze, his hand hovering over the phone. "That's impossible. Our debt is held by a consortium of offshore lenders." "Offshore lenders that I bought out," Harrison corrected, walking slowly toward the head of the table. "You over-leveraged the company, Radley. You borrowed against assets you didn't even own." "I own 60% of the voting shares," Radley shouted, his composure shattering. "You can't touch me," Harrison smiled, a cold, calculating expression. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the original 1,128 patent documents encased in protective archival sleeves. He tossed them onto the table. "Do you know what these are, Radley? These are the foundational patents for the refrigerated transport network, the very backbone of this company. They don't belong to Hamilton Enterprises. They belong to the estate of Arthur Hamilton, our great-grandfather. An estate that was never dissolved because Thomas Hamilton stole the company in 1931. Harrison opened the 1,931 ledger and turned it toward the board members. "It's all documented right here. Thomas stole the infrastructure, but Arthur hid the actual intellectual property and the capital in a vault under Oak Haven Mill. The very mill you gave me to humiliate me." Bradley stared at the yellowed pages, his face draining of all color. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. "My firm filed a federal injunction this morning," Pierce announced to the stunned room. "Hamilton Enterprises owes 90 years of retroactive licensing fees and patent royalties to the Arthur Hamilton estate. The total sum exceeds the current market cap of this company by roughly $400 million. Hamilton Enterprises is, as of this exact moment, entirely insolvent." Chaos erupted in the boardroom. Investors began shouting, pulling out their phones, realizing their portfolios were suddenly tied to a sinking ship. Radley slumped back into his chair, breathing heavily. You destroyed the company. You destroyed our legacy just to get back at me." "No, Radley," Harrison said quietly, leaning over the table so only his brother could hear him. "You destroyed the company when you built it on lies and greed. I am simply reclaiming the legacy." Harrison snapped his fingers, and Pierce handed him a manila envelope. Harrison dropped it onto Radley's lap. "What is this?" Radley whispered, his voice trembling. "That is a deed to a one-bedroom apartment in a severely depressed neighborhood in Gary, Indiana," Harrison said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "And a cashier's check for $10,000. Consider it a parting gift. You always liked modern capital. Now get out of my building." The reversal was absolute. Within a month, Hamilton Enterprises was forced into a massive restructuring to settle the catastrophic patent debt. The board stripped Radley of all his shares and ousted him from the industry entirely. Harrison absorbed the company's assets, merging them with Oak Haven Capital to create a new debt-free logistics empire. Harrison didn't stay in the Chicago high-rise. he moved the executive headquarters to upstate New York. A year later, Harrison stood on the heavy oak balcony of Oak Haven Mill, holding a glass of pristine, 100-year-old bourbon. The river roared peacefully below him, the massive, restored water, returning steadily, churning the water into white foam. The mill was no longer a symbol of his ruin. It was a fortress of his own making. He had been kicked out with nothing, handed a piece of rotting wood meant to be his tombstone. Instead, he had dug into the dirt, unearthed the ghosts of his family's past, and built an empire that no one would ever take from him again. If you were captivated by Harrison's incredible journey from a ruined mill to a multi-million-dollar empire, make sure to hit that like button. Share this incredible story of betrayal, hidden treasure, and ultimate revenge with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life dramas and hidden history stories every single week. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you found a secret vault under your floorboards?